All right, welcome back to the Rock and Roll Ghost podcast. This week on our show, we have, a jack of all trades. The man's been everywhere. Jonathan Taplin. He's worked with Bob Dylan and the band. He's put together the concert for Bangladesh. He produced a ton of movies, including Mean Streets and The Last Waltz. He's done so many things. It's kind of crazy that you've been able to have this kind of a varied career. How are you doing today, Jonathan?
I'm doing great.
Good. And you're in Los Angeles?
I am.
Okay. How's everything in Los Angeles?
It's beautiful, very sunny and gorgeous weather.
Yeah, excellent. Let me get a little situated here. I'm a little far down. Not like anybody wants to pay attention to what I'm looking like, but well, the reason why I'm talking today is for your upcoming book. By the time this airs, it'll either just been released or it's just about to be released, depending on how things work out schedule-wise. The Magic Years, which you recount from your childhood all the way through, through all your film production and everything else. What prompted you to write the book?
Well, I've been kind of lucky. I happened to be in the right place at the right time in a lot of kind of seminal events. And I just thought a first-person account of some things like Bob Dylan going electric for the first time, or the concert for Bangladesh, or, making Mean Streets, or any number of things were kind of fun to recount. And so, I thought I'd do that.
Yeah. Were you, was somebody pushing you to go ahead to do this, or what was the impetus?
I had an editor, Steve Wasserman, who had edited most of Greil Marcus's books. I don't know if you know about Greil Marcus, but
I know Greil. I mean, I don't know him, but I know Greil.
A great rock critic, and so Steve had an affinity for music books, and so he encouraged me.
Cool. When did you start in earnest to start working on the book?
About a year ago.
Wow, so that wasn't. You had probably a pretty good chance to spend a little more time than most people normally would with a career that you have now, working at the school. What was the most difficult part of writing? Figuring out the way you wanted it to go, or did you just always figure A to B was the right way to move things?
Well, no, part of it was to be particularly more personal than I had originally planned.
Yeah.
I in terms of dealing with, I had a couple of failed marriages. I had some issues with artists who were having trouble with drugs and stuff like that. And, the decisions to what to say and what not to say. And, I eventually came to the idea that if the general public already knew that Eric Clapton had a big drug problem, I wasn't going to be talking out of school to talk about my particular problems getting him on stage in the concert for Bangladesh.
Right.
So, but it was those kind of things I had to wrestle with.
Mm-hmm. I'm probably going to go a little all over the place, but since you brought up the concert for Bangladesh, George obviously got in touch with you. How, if you could kind of recount in a short form, obviously you cover it in the book, kind of the beginnings of that and how it ended up versus how you started, the path you started on for it.
Well, it came together very quickly. George was in 1971 was separating himself from the rest of the Beatles, and he was making All Things Must Pass in New York with Phil Spector.
Yeah.
And he would come up to Woodstock on the weekends to hang out. He was close with Bob Dylan. He was close with Robbie Robertson and the rest of the band, and he really admired them. And so he came up one weekend in April and stayed at my house in Woodstock. And he said to me, look, Ravi Shankar has called me and said there's this horrible thing happening in Bangladesh. People are starving. There's been a huge cyclone. The Pakistani government, it wasn't called Bangladesh at that time, it was called East Pakistan. Pakistani government is not doing anything, and the people are going crazy. And so we need to do something. So we decided we could book Madison Square Garden. And the first date that was open was the first day of August. And the night before was open too, the end of July. So we could have a day to set up and a day to have the concert.
Right.
And then it came together remarkably quickly.
Yeah.
I mean, George called Ringo. He called Klaus Vormann, who had played with him in Munich, had been an old friend.
Yeah.
He called Eric. He called Billy Preston, Leon Russell. I mean, the core band came together very quickly. Jim Keltner. Then he added Bob Dylan and a few other things afterwards, Badfinger and some others. But it was remarkably fast to pull it together. And, you know, quite frankly, from the original vision, which was, okay, Ravi is going to play first, and that's going to be a challenge because you're going to have to get all these rock and roll fans to sync through 25 minutes of Indian music.
Right.
And then Ravi will go off, and then the band will come on, and then we'll just play straight through. And that's what it turned out to be.
Yeah. Yeah, it's been forever. My mom is a huge Beatles fan, huge George fan, huge Eric Clapton fan. I mean, for God's sake, if Eric Clapton said, leave your husband today, she'd leave. So that's kind of how I was, presented with the concert from Bangladesh as a kid, way back whenever it first, would appear on TV, and then MTV would show like concert clips, because back then they were searching for anything for a video,
right?
So they just use live footage that they were able to find, and it was after Woodstock. I mean, it was kind of like the first or the next thing, really, that was in that mindset, and I just remember I probably wouldn't have known about Bangladesh at that age any other way, because if it wasn't for George Harrison,
Yeah, but I think that's one of the great things about the concert. It did actually create awareness. Yes, it raised over the last 30 years or 40 years, $30 or $40 million for UNICEF. But more importantly, at that point, it made people aware of Bangladesh, and that was an important issue.
Yeah.
Both the politicians and the average citizen. And the issues for me were, just technical. As I said, Eric was going to be the guitar player from the beginning, because he had played on As My Guitar Gently Weeps.
Right.
And so we did a week of rehearsals, and he didn't show up.
Oh, God.
And every day we'd send a car out to his house in England, and his girlfriend would come out and say he's too sick to travel.
Oh, so you were rehearsing in England?
We were rehearsing in New York.
Oh.
And at a rehearsal studio above Carnegie Hall. Okay. But Eric hadn't even gotten on the plane yet.
Oh, I see. You're sending the car for him to get on the plane. Gotcha.
Yeah.
That's throwing me off.
And, every day he'd go out, and eventually George said, well, it looks like he's not going to make it. So he kind of put out the word, and, 10 guitar players like Peter Frampton started showing up at the Park Lane Hotel in New York, and they putting their hand up. Yeah. And eventually we picked a guy that we all knew named Jesse Ed Davis, who played with Taj Mahal and was a kind of low-key, good guitar player.
Yeah.
And then I sent word through the Apple office in London to Eric that we didn't need him anymore. And then, of course... he got on the plane.
Oh, for God's sake, no, you can't do it without me. That's great. Because you know what? The guy from Taj Mahal would have probably been 100 times less of a pain in the ass than it was to get Eric there. So,
well, we ended up keeping Jesse
on
the. No, we let him play too.
Oh, might as well.
He played rhythm guitar.
Okay, I didn't know. I didn't realize.
You can't hire him and then fire him.
That's awesome. I still got the gig. All right. And
then Eric tells a very funny story on himself, which is that he was so out of it, stoned, that we were about to play As My Guitar Gently Weeps, and he picked up the wrong guitar. He picked up this big hollow body Gretsch guitar, which is the exact wrong guitar to play that kind of a solo on. He needed he needed his Telecaster, right? But he got through it. He just bulled his way through it. It was amazing.
Well, I mean, in the end, the man knows how to play a guitar. So
yeah, exactly.
If there's one thing you can't say about Eric Clapton is that he definitely, you can't say that he doesn't know how to play a guitar. So
no.
Pretty much, you can give him a $50 guitar or the wrong style guitar, he'll be able to play it. So that's awesome. What was your thought? I mean, what was your whole energy, your whole mindset and feeling? Were you just like, by the time it was over, was one of those things that we were just exhausted after it was over?
Totally, because we did 2 shows in one day. We did an afternoon show and an evening show.
Yeah.
And but Bob Dylan played brilliantly. He and George did a duet. I mean, it was just almost perfect. The second show was a little bit better than the first show, as you would expect, because everybody got over their nerves and learned how to play together. So I was just incredibly grateful.
Well, I think that was one of the fun things about that show, from what, again, my limited memory, because it's been forever since I've seen it, is the idea that these guys, I mean, that's the beauty of professional musicians, is that they can come together and, it may not be as seamless as somebody that's been, touring for a year or 10 years or what have you, but people know how to play. So as long as you know how to play and you aren't messed up, you're going to be okay.
Exactly.
Yeah. What was your biggest thrill of the night? I mean, were you able to detach yourself from running things to have a really big, oh my God, I can't believe I'm seeing this moment?
I think probably the Dylan set was great. And also Leon Russell did a version of Jumpin' Jack Flash.
Oh, cool.
It was just incredible.
Yeah.
I mean, as good as the Stones. I mean, it was really driving, and Leon is an amazing talent. And
I grew up. See, it's weird. Like, I'm not going to get too far off track here, but like growing up, like all that stuff was on my parents' speakers,
Mm-hmm.
And there came a point in the '80s when I was a teenager that. The Stones weren't a big thing in my house. So the older group I found myself attached to in the 80s was the Stones. And then I got into my own music, the stuff of the 80s and stuff like that. And it wasn't until probably the 2010s when I really started re-examining all the stuff I kind of grew up on, Leon and Billy Preston and Joe Cocker and Lynyrd Skynyrd and all these bands from times ago that I grew up listening to, that I really started to like, oh yeah, this is, I could hear this stuff again with fresh ears. It's not the stuff that my parents were into, and I was like, oh, I'm rejecting that.
Right.
Now it is good music. And it's like, I even rejected the Beatles for a really long time because it just wasn't, wasn't. I was tired of, as a kid, you're like, okay, yeah, great, the Beatles were great, yeah, got it. It's like,
right.
I need to, what my music that I'm into is great too. So the hell with the Beatles,
right?
But
right.
You realize that's kind of foolishness when they basically wrote the book for how things can be. Without the Beatles, there's no Radiohead taking bizarre chances in the 90s,
No. It's funny about Joe Cocker. So Leon toured with Joe Cocker.
Yeah, the
Mad Dogs and Englishmen.
Yeah.
And Leon told me a great story about that. That tour happened literally 4 weeks after Richard Nixon had declared that he was going to go spray this chemical called paraquat on all the marijuana in Mexico to basically poison it. So all of a sudden, this massive rock and roll tour was starting, and there was no marijuana to be found anywhere. This was a problem.
Oh, no.
This was a big problem.
Not in the early 70s.
So Leon said that some crazy person came up with this idea called angel dust, in which he sprayed elephant tranquilizer on oregano leaves and pretended it was pot. And so Leon said he was a religious man and he didn't think it was a natural thing. It was a chemical. And so he refused to smoke it. But Joe Cocker and a lot of people around it smoked it every day, just like it was pot. And Leon said by the end of the 4-month tour, Joe was having a hard time putting a sentence together. He could still sing his songs, because that was just learned muscle memory. But his brain,
you couldn't have a conversation with him.
Right, you couldn't have a conversation with him.
I tell you, there was something great about the great thing about the 60s is the expanding of your mind and your opening up your world to the world itself. But boy, it led to some dangerous stuff, didn't it?
Well, I honestly, I think the danger didn't come until the 70s.
Yeah.
I mean, I think really...
Well, it's just like that was the doorway opening, and then the 70s were a very dark period.
Yeah. I mean, the 70s was when people started using cocaine and heroin, and that's when it got really bad.
Yeah.
I eventually left the music business.
Yeah. Now, and I kind of want to circle back, but your first foray out of the music business was with Scorsese and Mean Streets, and just the idea of bankrolling on this kid that had only made he was one of the editors on Woodstock, and he had directed Boxcar Bertha for Corman.
Right.
Like that was kind of all he had done besides his student films and all that.
Right.
But he was coming out of the Corman, grind, the Corman manufacturing plant,
right.
Which is, I still say that what happened with everything with Corman is amazing. I mean, just the fact that it was like film school. It was his own film school. But what about him that made you say, okay, I'm going to go out and search for $500,000 to get you doing this movie?
So when I decided to leave Woodstock and go to California, a guy named Jay Cox, who was a writer for Time magazine, and he had done the cover story on the band for Time.
Right.
And he said, I have this friend named Martin Scorsese, and he edited part of Woodstock, and he's a total rock and roll fan.
Yeah.
And when you go out to LA, look him up. And so I did. And he came up to my house in Laurel Canyon, and he brought this script called Season of the Witch.
Right.
And he'd been trying to make it for like 3 years. And it was kind of a sequel to his film school movie. And
Who's
so,
that knocking at my door?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay.
It was the same kind of Harvey Keitel character, you know, who was Marty.
Yeah.
Right, autobiographical.
Right, essentially.
And so I read it, and then the next day I went down to William Morris, which was his agent, and saw all his student films.
Right.
Because Boxcar Bertha wasn't out yet at that point. And the one that just knocked me out was called It's Not Just You, Murray. And it's a kind of weird, Fellini-esque movie where he breaks the fourth wall. He does everything as the guy talks right to the camera. And it was just so funny and delightful. And I thought, this kid is really good, you know?
Yeah.
And so I'd made some money in the music business, and I had a friend who had some money. And so I was so naive. I didn't know you weren't supposed to invest your own money in movies. You know, there's a phrase in Hollywood.
Oh, yes.
OPM.
Yeah.
Other people's money.
Exactly.
But I didn't know that. Nobody had told me that.
Yeah.
And so we made it. And then we literally, Marty and I, like two sad sack salesmen, took the two film cans and went around from studio to studio.
Yeah.
I had a lawyer who set up some meetings, and we showed it to these executives at the studios to ask if they would buy it. And the first one, we went to Universal, and they said, nah, this is not a studio movie. And then I thought, oh, hell, I might lose all my money, you know? And that would be a bad thing.
It would be.
Then we went to Warner Brothers, and, you know, near the end, the president of Warner Brothers, John Calley, started to walk back in the screening room. And I thought, oh, hell, you know, they're 2 for 2, we're out.
Yeah,
and he sat down next to me and said, this is the best movie I've seen all year, but I have to take a leak. Would you mind stopping it?
Yeah.
And so we stopped it. He went out, he came back, we finished the movie, and he got up and he said, we're buying it. It was just like, in those days, you know, executives actually had power. There were no committees that he had to check it with.
Right.
And so, you know, we sold it to Warner Brothers, made all our money back, and made a good little profit, and the rest is history.
At the time of selling it, did you have temp music in it, or did
we had all the music in it?
Oh, you had all the music. Then Warner Brothers had to deal with securing the rights.
I had secured most of the rights, although we hadn't paid for them yet.
Gotcha.
Right, we had them contractually
upon release. Yeah.
Right. And the only one that was weird was Jumpin' Jack Flash. You know, and
still, that wasn't with them though. It was with why am I blanking on his name?
Alan Klein.
Alan Klein, yeah.
He owned the rights.
Yeah.
And he licensed it to me because I'd done Bangladesh with him.
Right.
But he also said he had the right to take it out if he didn't like the movie.
Right.
The idea that Alan Klein would have some kind of taste to do that. But once Warner Brothers, you know, said they were releasing the movie, then he didn't even worry about it.
Right.
It was fine. And to me, that's a great thing, you know.
Yeah. So how did that work? Ended up working out for you financially? I mean, you got your money back for putting it in. Did you end up making a little bit of money as the film went on? Like, you know, through the years in video and all that stuff?
Marty and I get a check every summer, every July from Warner Brothers. Now it's almost 50 years later. We're still getting a check every year.
Yeah, because it's been on Netflix a bunch. So
yeah, it's a decent check too.
Yeah.
So I mean, if you make a good movie and didn't spend too much money on it, you can make money on the movie.
Yeah, for real. But it didn't. That experience. I mean, you've done other film work, but you didn't like say, okay, well, I'm going to double down and all that. Well, it took a while before you worked on something else. What was the reason for not maybe saying, okay, this is it. This is, you know, I'm a movie producer now.
Well, I continued to go back and forth between music. I mean,
yeah.
Bob did the tour 74. So I
Rolling
kind of
Thunder?
No, it was before
Oh, it
that
was before
with the
Rolling
band.
Thunder, sorry.
Bob and the band.
Oh, right. Yeah,
It's known
sorry.
as Tour 74. So I
Yeah.
kind of helped them get that started. Then I went back to the movies. I mean, I tell a story in the book about a movie that I made with Terry Malick, a screenplay that Terry Malick wrote that was a disaster called The Dion Brothers. And, you know, learned later that Quentin Tarantino thinks it's a grindhouse classic. He thinks that, you know, he wanted to remake it. Then we made the Last Waltz, you know, which was the next big film that I made.
Well, that would probably be, for me. My father and I never really saw eye to eye much, and we don't really have much of a relationship. And the man I was talking about, my mom leaving Eric Clapton for, would be my stepdad. But we both seemed to like the band, and he showed me the Last Waltz, and I remember as a kid just being like, "Oh wow, this is amazing." And as I got older, just to give you a little bit of background, in the '80s I became a band freak. I bought all their albums on cassette, and then at some point when Levon's book came out, I'm like, wow, this is like peeling a layer of skin off a story where I thought the Last Waltz was the end all be all to what the band was about. And then to realize there is a difference between stories that are told as like the canon idea of the band and what some of the members actually felt. What was your relationship like with the guys in the group? And sadly, I mean, there's only Robbie and Garth now. I mean, it's tragic. It's just tragic that that Levon and Richard and Rick are gone.
Yeah.
You're obviously still friends with Robbie, but
right.
What was your relationship like with the other guys post the Last Waltz?
I would say it was uncomfortable. Specifically, Levon thought that I was on Robbie's side. And, you know, I understand Levon's pain and his hurt. And a lot of that came out of the fact that, you know, in 1969, it was not obvious that in the year 2000, the only people who would make any money in the music business would be songwriters.
Yeah.
In other words, the band had fans like you in the 80s and the 90s who continued to buy their cassettes, CDs, whatever. And they continued to make, Levon was making $100,000 a year in royalties, even into the late 90s. Then Napster came out in 2000, and that catalog business just stopped.
Yeah.
And so all of a sudden, Levon was not making any money, but Robbie continued to make money because ASCAP and BMI continued to collect money for songwriters from every Gap store that was playing music, every bar that was playing music.
Right.
Everybody was playing music in any place in the world, every song that was in the back of a movie. You know, the songwriters continued to make money. And the digital economy didn't stop that. Right. And so Levon saw Robbie continuing to make money, and he was not, and he was pissed. Yeah. But he never said any of that in the 60s or 70s. You know, here's the problem. I mean, just to be honest with you, in, say, 1970, I would get up early because I'm an early riser, and I would go over to Robbie's studio, and at 9:30 in the morning, he'd be in there writing music at the piano or at the guitar. And in the very first album, Music from Big Pink, Richard and Rick each wrote one or two songs. And in the second album, they each wrote one song. By the third album, they weren't writing any songs. It wasn't like Robbie said, well, you can't write any songs.
Yeah.
It was, they had just stopped doing it because, quite honestly, they like to stay up very late at night and they like to sleep in every morning.
Yeah.
And the same with Levon. And so the fact that they didn't write any songs is not Robbie's fault. I mean, he was just trying to make the music so they could go out and play and make records.
Yeah.
He needed to write 11 or 12 songs to get an album.
Yeah. Yeah, no, on that regard, I think that even in his book, Levon kind of gave the idea that they were all in different stages of unwell, from drink or drugs or what have you. And it certainly didn't help the creative process. But there are a couple of things, and I'm not putting you on this. I'm not going to put you on the spot or anything. But as a fan, I have my issues with Robbie. The issue with him and management basically kind of taking control of the group away, and that's from Levon's side, and I understand there might be some degrees that I don't know about with regards to that, but probably the most offensive thing to me personally, was that documentary that came out recently, where it felt like the band the rest of the guys were kind of relegated to nothing. And it was a very, in my opinion, whitewashed history of them, to the point where I actually was upset by it. And I don't normally get upset about documentaries, but it did bother me deeply.
Well, I mean, look, Robbie was putting out a book.
Yeah.
And some people came to him and said, we want to make a documentary about you. Yeah. And he said, well, that's not any good. You got to make it about me and the band, And so, I mean, he didn't really have much control over the editing of that, but needless to say,
I get that.
And needless to say, since it was only shot last year, there was nobody to talk to.
Yeah,
I mean, who are dead. I mean, Look, I mean, it's a sad situation, and
it is.
Robbie really did want to leave the road.
Yeah.
He never liked the road. I mean, that song "Stage Fright."
Oh yeah.
That's a real song. I mean, that comes from a real place. Yeah. And so, when the Last Waltz happened, that was it for Robbie. And the fact that the guys tried to go on and make music without him and it didn't really work, tells you something, I mean, and in some deep sense, I think from the end of the 74 tour with Dylan, when they all made a lot of money and they all snorted a lot of cocaine.
Oh yeah.
Things began to go downhill, and it was not pretty.
Yeah.
And then Richard killed himself, and then it went downhill from there.
Yeah. Well, and I also have to say, in defense of Robbie, from my own vantage point, I am a huge fan of his solo work. I remember when that first album that he did with Daniel Lanois came out, I was just blown away. Yeah. And I love this. I love the one where he melded kind of like a techno thing with Native American,
right.
Musicianship. I just think that so much of his music is amazing. I just think that and it's so hard because it's the past. It's 50, it's almost 50 years since the Last Waltz, and you have to remember that these are young guys that are in the midst of having their own mental, emotional, addiction issues. Nobody talked to each other. I mean, that movie, the movie about Metallica, but where they basically almost devolve on camera, but they're brought back together through psychiatry. Like, that stuff wasn't done back then.
No.
It just imploded. Beatles imploded. Nobody talked to each other.
Right.
It's like, but I think this is part of the problem with being a fan, is that you have an idealized version of it. The guys that are sitting there in their garage when they're 15, they're not the same people that they are when they're 25 and they've had success and they've toured the world and they've got homes and they've got maybe a wife or kids, or everything stacks on top of each other to cause more problems.
I talk about this in the book a lot. The psychology of keeping a band together is very, very hard.
Yeah.
I mean, can you imagine if you said to Picasso, well, you have to be in a band. You got to deal with 4 other guys who'll decide what this painting is going to look like.
Right.
It's screw you,
Yeah.
I mean, so on some certain level, every artist is an ego maniac.
Yeah.
Everybody who decides that they want to go up in front of 10,000 people and sing,
Right.
it takes a certain kind of ego, right?
Right.
And melding all those egos. I mean, I talk in the book about my friend Don Henley, who, I mean, quite frankly, he and Glenn Frey were not the best of friends.
No.
But at a certain point, after they broke up, and the Eagles' greatest hits came out and became the greatest selling CD, except for Michael Jackson.
Right.
The money was so great that they decided, well, we have to put ego aside and go out on the road. And they went out and had a whole other career again, a second career, But it's hard.
The positive thing with the guys in the Eagles that most of them were able to have. I mean, God, Don Henley in the '80s was huge.
Right.
I was a fan of the Eagles as a kid. They were another band, played in my house a lot, but it was like with Don Henley's first solo album, I was like somehow I claimed him as mine, and which made no sense because he was technically my parents' generation.
Right.
Their band. The band is light up a joint to.
Right.
But the '80s, Don Henley, it's weird because there's the dividing line between the long run, them ending, and Don Henley starting a solo career is so narrow, but it's like a gulf between the two.
I agree.
There's almost no connection to Don Henley's solo to Eagles, in a way, because he really embraced the new decade, which is fascinating. So it's all that, and then they get back together, and then. I know that the band, the Eagles, they kind of get chastised for kind of coming up with the being the original band with the golden circle seating and all that stuff. But that became, but these things were in the wind. Like all this stuff this is how the world was changing. I mean, the music industry. Let me ask you about that. I mean, you started so early on in rock and roll to what it is now. Could you ever imagine how concerts and how bands are managed and all that has changed so dramatically over the years?
No, I couldn't. I mean, if you think about the very first scene in my book is at the Newport Folk Festival, right?
Right.
And so here are all these important acts, all there playing for free, right? And all the money went to a foundation,
right?
The Newport Folk Festival Foundation, which then spent the money researching and trying to find old blues singers that could still, like Son House or Skip James, who could have a new career at the age of 70. That's how it was, like a charity.
Yeah.
And it's hard to imagine that kind of feeling or concern or willingness of the current generation to look out for the older guys around, I mean, that's hard. I mean, that is in a sense interesting about George Harrison, in the sense that he was really willing to do something and get everybody to play for free again. That was more like an old school idea.
Yeah. And you know, the interesting thing about you is that you've been very involved in the technological aspect of our times. Your other book, you know, talks about technology, you know, in monopolies and the such. Did you find that your generation was slow to evolve to technology in general? Do you feel like that's in particular the music business was extremely slow? I mean, they could have really held off the tropical storm that was file sharing if they had just adapted easier when it first came out.
I agree.
Yeah.
I mean, I think that the executives, you know, I mean, if you think about the late 90s,
yeah,
that was like the music business was growing at about 10, 12% a year. Prices for concert tickets were going up exponentially.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it's hard for you to know this, but I mean, in the 60s, you could go to the Fillmore for $5.
Right.
Right.
Yeah.
So, I mean, so the idea of paying $300 for a bad ticket at an Eagles concert is not something, you know.
It causes resentment.
Sure. So, but the people who ran the business in the late 90s just wanted to hang on. They were all of them like Clive Davis's age.
Yeah.
You know, so Clive Davis was not a spring chicken in the 90s.
No.
You know, and he was not interested in learning about new technology or thinking about that. I mean, the last change really had been the LP in 1956 or 1951 from 78s, where you could only put one song on a side, to LPs, long playing. And I mean, the CD is a change, but it isn't really a change. It was the same thing. It was an album. So the idea that somebody would come along and say, oh, well, why do you need to buy all 12 songs in this album? You can just get the one song you like.
Yeah.
Which was, then that just blew it apart.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah. Well, and the thing is that in the early days, they had the opportunity to do their own model, and they just decided to push forward just by them suing people, you know, random people doing it, the companies that provided it, and they couldn't put the genie back in the bottle after that.
And the history of technology, you know, I wrote this book, Move Fast and Break Things, and the history of technology is it never goes back in the bottle.
Right.
You will never get rid of Amazon. You will never get rid of Google. I mean, nobody is going to make another search engine. Who's going to go invest in another search engine to take on Google and spend $5 billion on that fool's parade, you know?
Right.
No way.
Yeah, it's pointless. It's absolutely pointless.
Yeah.
I don't even know what the next thing is. I mean, everybody's talking about chips, implants and stuff, and it's like, I don't know about that, but you know, because I remember when the big thing was Google Specs or whatever, with the glasses, Google S. Like, yeah, that never really. It's amazing how that didn't really go anywhere.
Well, I mean, quite honestly, I was always skeptical about virtual reality as well.
Yeah.
I mean, it didn't really go anywhere either.
No, it kind of had a blip, and then you saw it everywhere, and then it has kind of died down.
Yeah.
I don't want to keep you too much longer, but I want to kind of get to the some of the more about the book, and but I want to talk about, you know, your producing wasn't limited to Mean Streets and Last Waltz. You produced a movie I remember seeing at my local town's movie theater that I absolutely loved. It was the beginning of the resurgence for Dennis Hopper, called My Science Project.
Mm-hmm.
That for Touchstone, right?
Yeah.
How did you get involved with My Science Project? I have to know. And what was that? What was you were pretty hands-on as an actual producer, right?
What happened was I was at Walt Disney, working as a independent producer, and I used to go up every day to the executive dining room at the top of the animation building where all the executives were, and have lunch. And I'd come out, and the president of Walt Disney, whose name was Ron Miller, who was president because he was married to Walt's daughter, used to play poker for 3 hours every day right outside the executive dining room in front of everyone. Yeah. And so Disney was kind of going in the toilet. It was really, nothing was happening.
Right.
And so I made I went down to see these guys called the Bass Brothers, who were oil billionaires in Texas. And I said, look, this is the most undervalued company in the world. The whole film library is carried on the books for $20 million, all those classics. And so they said, well, this is a great idea, but we own 9.9% of Texaco, and we may have to go to 20%. So that's another $2 billion. So we can't do anything about Disney. So I went back to Disney, and about 2 months later, a guy named Saul Steinberg started a corporate raid on Walt Disney with the idea that he was going to break it up. He was going to sell off the parks, sell off the consumer product company, sell off the movie company.
Oh, man.
And so they freaked out, and, they were running around. And one day, Sid Bass called me and said, John, we just sold all our Texaco stock. We're ready to save the mouse. So I went down to the chairman of Walt Disney's office, Ray Watson, and I said, Ray, the Bass Brothers are sending a jet from Texas to pick up you and me, and we're going to go down, and we're going to make a deal so that this guy, Saul Steinberg, can't control the company.
Right.
And so he did. And so I ended up getting paid by the Bass Brothers as their investment advisor for doing that deal. So I made more money in literally 3 weeks than I'd made in 5 years. And then Disney, then I was the bright boy, and Disney said, well, we have this movie called My Science Project. Yeah. You want to produce it? It was like another gift to me. And so I took it on. It was a young guy, John Betchell. I mean, I like it. I don't love it.
It was a fun. I remember seeing it as a kid. It was a fun movie, but it's just like I know that it was the first step for Hopper coming back.
Yeah,
to call. And
yes,
that
definitely.
He did Velvet, and he did Hoosiers and all that stuff. And did you spend any time with Dennis?
Oh yeah, I spent a lot of time with Dennis. He was getting himself back in shape, and he, like everybody, Dennis had gone through many crazy times, I mean, I'm sure you read the stories about the last movie and everything. Where, And so he had gone off the deep end with drugs and everything else. But
just his performance in Apocalypse Now is not even a performance.
No, it's an open wound.
Yeah. I mean, I can't tell you, there are like 5 movies I watch constantly. The Godfather films, the first Star Wars, and Blade Runner, and then Apocalypse Now. And I bought every version of Apocalypse Now on cassette.
Yep.
No, I didn't buy it on Laserdisc. I bought every Blu-ray, DVD, what have you.
Me too. And
can't possibly come out with another version.
And the same with every version of Blade Runner.
Yeah. I've got a giant case.
There must be 6 or 7 versions of Blade Runner.
But Hopper was always like a damn, like just a spirit, like And
Totally.
Losing him was a big one. It was like,
yeah, I agree.
But yeah, I had to ask you about that because you've done other things. You did Under Fire with Nick Nolte.
Yeah, I did. I don't know if you ever seen Until the End of the World, Wim Wenders.
That I've got that on Criterion. I haven't watched.
Yeah.
I haven't watched.
Oh, watch the long version. It's really.
Yeah, I watched. I watched the original years ago, and a friend of mine, my best friend since childhood. We're like the only people I've ever met that I've ever talked to about Until the End of the World. But we both love it. And I've got
there's a whole fan club on Facebook on specifically around this long version, which was, rumored. I mean, we wanted to make it as 2 movies, but Warner Brothers said contractually, no, you have to deliver a 2-hour and 30-minute movie.
With Warner Brothers and 2-hour movies. That was Zack Snyder's problem with the Justice League.
Right. And the movie was 5 hours long.
Yeah.
So to get it from 5 to 2 is hard.
Yeah. Talk a little bit about that experience. How have you been able to see the Criterion version?
Of course. Yeah. I love it.
You're happy that it finally made its way out. Were you involved with getting that version put together at all?
Yeah.
How did that go? When did that process start? And how
Wim Wenders, the director, wanted it from the beginning. So he set about trying to get it out there from the beginning. And literally 12 years ago, he got it out in Italy in a 2 DVD set. And then he got it out in Germany. And then eventually we got it out in America.
Yeah.
I mean, that was one of the great experiences of my life. It wasn't, for me financially, it was not that great a move because I financed a lot of that movie. But as an experience, I didn't personally finance.
Gotcha. Okay, good.
Yeah.
You learned your lesson.
I learned my lesson. It was OPM. It was a Japanese company that put up a lot of the money. But anyway, the point was that we spent 1 year location scouting that movie.
Yeah.
I mean, we went to Australia, Japan, Africa, Europe, South America, US. I mean, it was an extraordinary experience.
Yeah.
And Wim is this extraordinary spirit. I mean, he's a very brilliant, spiritually deep guy. And, there's parts of that movie that are so prescient now in the sense that these people get addicted to these little screens. And we were making that in 1989.
Yeah.
There was no iPhone at that point. The idea that someone would get addicted to this little screen was absurd, but it turned out to be really true.
Well, there was definitely this. What I loved, and because I love the soundtrack too. What I love is that it dovetailed right with U2 coming out with Achtung Baby.
Yep.
And their whole, I mean, it's like everybody. There were certain people seeing the horizon, that the way things were going to change. The internet, devices getting smaller, blah, blah, blah. They saw that was a real possibility. Now, sometimes like Blade Runner, you get into telling the future and you don't always get it right. That's why you laugh when you see Pan Am, in 2019 when they were gone long before 2019, stuff like that. But that movie, what was always fascinating to me is just the tie-in with what U2, because I know that U2 were such a part of that film in terms of music.
Totally.
But just, and, they have a lot of stuff to do with Vim in other projects too. And it's just, there was a certain thing in the early 90s, especially where all of that stuff was kind of converging and people were seeing what was on the horizon. There's another movie like it is this movie that Catherine Bigelow did called Strange Days. With Ray Fiennes. That's also like in that same kind of mindset. It's like it tells of a near future where things are going to start going haywire. And quite honestly, we kind of see that how that's happened in some ways, not maybe in the exact ways, but
I would say to you that I actually think that Blade Runner does foretell the future in interesting ways. There is
I won't argue with that.
There is a very long thing. Ezra Klein, who's this reporter for the New York Times, did a podcast with a science fiction writer this week, in which they're talking about artificial intelligence having feelings. Mm-hmm. The possibility that in the future artificial intelligence can have feelings.
Yeah.
And there's that extraordinary scene where the chief guy, the blonde guy,
Rutger Hauer's character.
Yeah, Roy.
Yeah,
right, Rutger Hauer,
yeah.
where he puts his hand on a nail.
Yeah.
Goes through his hand in order to try and see if he could feel something.
Yeah.
And of course he doesn't, because he's still a robot. But I mean, I just think these films about the future are very important because they help you actually think about the present. I mean, that's what Vim did, and I think that's what Ridley did with Blade Runner.
Yeah, the interesting thing about artificial intelligence is we're going to get into, and I think maybe the generation coming up that's younger than you and I might end up having to wrestle with one day, is that we've obviously taken a turn on the idea that slavery is an awful thing, but what if we're allowing things that are humanoid to be slaves?
That's you've got to read this. I'll send you the link on this.
Okay.
This thing, because that's exactly what this guy is talking about.
Yeah.
That we will treat artificial intelligence like we treat animals.
Yeah.
In other words, we'll be willing to eat them and kill them and do whatever. And he says, look, animals have feelings, but we don't treat them as if that's important.
Right. Yeah. There's a fascinating, I haven't seen it, but the synopsis for it sounds fascinating. It's called My Octopus Teacher, which is on Netflix, I guess, now. And it's about a guy that basically develops a relationship with an octopus.
Yeah.
And it's just the idea of it's fascinating. And I've already seen people like, no, I can't eat octopus. It's like, yeah, I mean, I get that. It's like, it's when you think about it, the idea of eating animals is very disheartening. Have I stopped doing it? No.
I haven't either.
Yeah, it's like I can't go all in on veganism. I think that animals should be treated as respectfully as possible. Yes, definitely. I think there's a reason. My stepdad's a hunter. He's as much of an ethical hunter as he can be. If he kills something, he uses every part of it. And they didn't die in vain. It isn't like these assholes that go out to Africa and just shoot something just to shoot it.
Right.
Well, let me do a final question for you, and then I can let you go. And again, thank you very much for taking the time. The book is fascinating. I'll admit I haven't finished it. I am reading so many books all of a sudden. I don't know. All of a sudden, like I'm on a burst of author interviews for some reason. So I'm like juggling all of these books, and I'm trying to read everything. So I still have yours to finish, but I love what I've read so far. So, and I wish you the best of luck. The book is called The Magic Years, and it's out. It's out in
May 4th.
May 4th. May the 4th be with you, in terms of Star Wars language. Right. And what are your thoughts on getting this out, and what are your aspirations for it? I mean, what kind of, where's your head at with what this book can do?
Well, look, I mean, we're going to embark starting on May 4th on literally a virtual bookstore tour.
Yeah.
And that's, I mean, we're dealing with the pandemic, and when you used to do a book tour, you would go and you'd go to a bookstore and you'd talk, and then they'd sell books and everything. But now the big bookstores all around the world are having these virtual, talks. And so I'm doing it with a lot of my friends, T-Bone Burnett and Roseanne
Awesome.
Cash. And, I'm doing a lot of these talks for the next 2 months. So look, I hope it gets as widely diffused as possible. I think that there's a lot of lessons for our current generation to learn from the role that artists played in the 60s and 70s in the society, in the politics, in everything. And hopefully maybe there's some lessons to be learned.
Yeah.
I'll be honest with you. I think a lot of what I see on TV right today is very dark, and it's very, it's the rise of the anti-hero.
Mm-hmm.
Shows like Succession or Breaking Bad or all these things, where the lead protagonist is a horrible person.
Yeah.
And I come from a time when I have a dream, or the times they are changing, where there was a positive energy coming out of the culture, that we could make change, not like the fix is in, it's Chinatown, Jake, forget it. So I'm hoping maybe a kind of more utopian culture emerges, because right today it's very dystopian. It's very nihilistic.
Yeah, that for some reason you just saying that reminded me at the beginning of the book where you're talking about your relationship with your father, where your idealism coming up as a as a younger person in that time clashed with his idea that you change the world by changing laws.
Right.
And there is in reality, well, in a hopeful reality, there's a mixture of the two, because honestly, we're not going to get anywhere in this country without making real change to laws, which it almost seems like it's impossible to do right now, which is disturbing. But there is a real sense of that 60s thing coming back right now, where people are making their voices heard. It's just that the problem is there's another side that has the opportunity to abut it, to debate the whole thing on their side, and it gets the message ends up getting clouded, because you have two sides now with the ability to face off against each other.
Yeah.
And nothing gets, not nothing, but oftentimes it doesn't get pushed to government to make that change. And we're in a real dangerous point, I think, in our history.
But I make the point in the book that culture often leads politics.
Mm-hmm.
In other words, Bob Dylan was singing about civil rights blowing in the wind in 1962. There wasn't a law until 1965 to say that blacks could vote. In other words, culture is ahead of politics often.
Yes.
And maybe that can happen again. But the culture makers have to want to play that role.
Yeah.
The musicians, the filmmakers.
Yeah, and I don't see that it's weird how we see that from regular people, and we see people in celebrity backing certain things, but we don't see the push in terms of filmmaking or songwriting to push against it.
I saw more activism from LeBron James and his friends over voting rights last year than I saw from any musician or any filmmaker.
Because people are afraid now. They're afraid to do anything because of negative reaction.
Right. But LeBron wasn't afraid.
No, because he's LeBron. There's a certain level where you're untouchable. And unfortunately, we're at that point where only the truly untouchable, or the truly completely fearless, like, I don't give a shit if my career ends tomorrow.
Right.
I'm going to say what's right. But there aren't that many of them in popular entertainment, because it's so managed. It's so controlled through agents, through managers.
You're totally right.
People. Yeah.
You're totally right.
And we desperately need that to spearhead things, because on the ground, people want change.
Read the final chapter, and that's what it's all about. It's about a hope for how artists can take that role again.
I'm certainly, because you listen to a song like Ohio, and it still has an impact today.
Totally agree. Totally agree.
Well, Jonathan, I want to thank you very much.
Thanks so much, man. It was really been a blast.
Yeah, it was a pleasure. I really appreciate it. Good luck with the book. Good luck with everything else, and hopefully we'll talk again in the future.
Okay, great.
Thank you. Have a good day.
Bye-bye.
All right, bye.